October 14th, 1944, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Kaneyoshi Muto of the Imperial Japanese Navy pressed his thumb against the firing button of his Mitsubishi A6M0, sending streams of 7.7mm bullets toward the approaching American fighter. The rounds struck the enemy aircraft's wing and fuselage, creating small puffs of aluminum dust and fabric. The American fighter, an F4U Corsair, barely seemed to notice. Then the Corsair's nose erupted in flame and thunder that Muto had never experienced before. 4 20mm cannons, each firing at 650 rounds per minute, created a wall of high-explosive shells that tore through the morning air with devastating precision. In the span of 2 seconds, the Corsair fired 43 20mm rounds. Each shell contained enough explosive to destroy a small building. The Zero simply disintegrated. What Lieutenant Commander Muto could not have known, as fragments of his aircraft scattered across the Philippine waters, was that he had just encountered the deadliest fighter armament configuration ever mounted on an American naval aircraft. The cannon-armed F4U Corsair represented a fundamental shift in American fighter philosophy, from quantity of fire to quality of destruction, and Japanese pilots, trained to survive against machine gun fire, were utterly unprepared for the devastating power of high-explosive cannon shells. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The development of the cannon-armed Corsair began in early 1943, when American pilots returning from combat in the Solomon Islands reported troubling observations about their standard armament. The F4U Corsair, armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, could riddle Japanese fighters with holes, yet watch them continue flying. Pilot after pilot described hitting Zeros repeatedly, seeing fabric tear and metal puncture, only to have the enemy aircraft escape or continue fighting. Major Gregory Boyington, commanding VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, filed a detailed combat report in September 1943 that captured the frustration. "We are hitting them consistently," he wrote, "but they do not go down. The Zero's light construction allows our 50 caliber rounds to pass through without transferring sufficient energy to cause structural failure. We need more destructive power per hit." The problem was fundamental. The 50 caliber machine gun, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at approximately 2,800 feet per second, created relatively small holes in aircraft structures. Against heavily armored German fighters, this was sufficient because the rounds would strike vital systems or penetrate crew compartments. Against the lightly built but efficiently designed Japanese fighters, the rounds often passed completely through the aircraft without hitting critical components. American ordnance experts had been studying this problem since early 1942, when Navy pilots in the Marshall Islands reported similar experiences. The solution was theoretically simple: replace the machine guns with cannons firing high-explosive shells. The technical challenge was enormous. 20mm cannons were substantially larger and heavier than 50 caliber machine guns. They required different ammunition handling systems, modified wing structures, and completely redesigned firing circuits. The Hispano-Suiza HS-404 20mm cannon, manufactured under license by various American companies, had proven itself in British service aboard Spitfires and Hurricanes. The weapon fired a 20mm shell weighing approximately 4½ ounces, compared to the 50 caliber bullets 1 3/4 ounces. More importantly, the 20mm shell could be fitted with high-explosive warheads, containing enough explosive to destroy aircraft structures that machine gun bullets merely punctured. The explosive warhead was the key difference. A 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round relied on kinetic energy and a small incendiary charge to damage targets. A 20mm high-explosive shell detonated inside the target aircraft, creating blast effects and fragmentation that could sever control cables, rupture fuel lines, and destroy structural components that solid bullets might miss entirely. Vought Aircraft, manufacturer of the Corsair, began developing the cannon-armed variant in March 1943, The project, designated F4U required extensive redesign of the wing structure. The standard F4U-1's 650 caliber machine guns were mounted in the outer wing panels, 3 guns per wing. The installation was relatively simple because machine guns were compact and lightweight. The 4 20mm cannons required for the F4U-1C were substantially larger. Each cannon measured 47 inches in length and weighed 61 pounds, compared to the machine gun's 28 inches and 64 pounds. The ammunition was equally bulky. Each cannon was fed by a 60-round drum, compared to the machine gun's flexible belt feed system that could accommodate up to 400 rounds per gun. The wing modifications were extensive. Vought engineers enlarged the wing gun bays, redesigned the landing gear wells to accommodate ammunition drums, and reinforced the wing structure to handle the cannon's recoil forces. Each cannon generated approximately 1,500 pounds of recoil force when firing, compared to the machine gun's 400 pounds. The wing spars required strengthening to prevent structural damage during sustained firing. The first F4U-1C prototype flew in July 1943. Test pilots immediately noted the weapon's devastating effectiveness against aerial targets. During initial firing trials at Naval Air Station Patuxent River, the cannon-armed Corsair destroyed target drones with single bursts that would have required extended firing with machine guns. The high-explosive shells detonated inside the target aircraft, creating damage that was immediately apparent and usually fatal. Production of the F4U-1C began in September 1943, with initial deliveries scheduled for December. The Navy planned to equip selected squadrons with cannon-armed aircraft while maintaining machine gun armament for others. The mixed approach reflected uncertainty about the trade-offs involved. The cannons provided superior destructive power but carried less total ammunition and were more prone to mechanical problems. The ammunition difference was significant. The standard F4U-1 carried 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, 400 rounds per gun. The F4U-1C carried only 240 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 60 rounds per cannon. In practical terms, this meant approximately 15 seconds of firing time for the machine gun version versus 8 seconds for the cannon version. Pilots had to be more selective about when and how they engaged targets. The first combat squadron to receive F4U-1C aircraft was VMF 215, the Fighting Corsairs, commanded by Major Robert Owens. The squadron was stationed at Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, flying daily combat missions against Japanese installations on Rabaul and escorting bombing raids throughout the region. The Marines received their first cannon-armed Corsairs in January 1944. Major Owens conducted extensive training with his pilots before allowing them to use the cannons in combat. The weapons required different gunnery techniques than machine guns. The limited ammunition meant pilots had to achieve hits with their initial burst rather than relying on sustained fire to walk rounds onto target. The cannon shells also had different ballistic characteristics, requiring slight adjustments to established gunnery procedures. The first combat encounter between a cannon-armed Corsair and Japanese fighters occurred on February 8, 1944. First Lieutenant Robert Anderson, flying F4U-1C Bureau No. 82285, was escorting SBD Dauntless dive bombers, attacking Japanese shipping near New Ireland when 6 A6M0s intercepted the formation. Anderson engaged the lead Zero from a range of approximately 300 yards. His combat report, preserved in Marine Corps historical archives, described the encounter in clinical terms that barely conveyed the devastating effectiveness of the cannon armament. I fired a 2-second burst at the leading enemy aircraft, observed multiple strikes on fuselage and wing root. Target aircraft exploded immediately and crashed into the sea. No debris larger than 3 feet observed. The destruction was so complete that Anderson's wingman initially thought the Zero had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. Only after reviewing gun camera footage did squadron intelligence officers confirm that cannon shells had caused the explosion. The high-explosive warheads had detonated inside the Zero's fuel tanks, creating a fuel-air explosion that destroyed the aircraft instantly. Word of the cannon's effectiveness spread quickly through marine aviation units in the Pacific. Pilots who had grown frustrated with machine guns' inability to bring down Japanese fighters immediately requested transfers to cannon-equipped squadrons. The weapon's reputation grew with each combat encounter, as Japanese aircraft that might have survived machine gun attacks were destroyed by single bursts of cannon fire. Japanese naval aviation intelligence first became aware of the cannon-armed Corsairs in March 1944, through analysis of combat reports and interrogation of surviving pilots. What they discovered alarmed them profoundly. American fighters were now armed with weapons that could destroy Japanese aircraft with single hits, regardless of the pilot's skill or the aircraft's maneuverability. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots with 64 confirmed victories, encountered a cannon-armed Corsair during a combat air patrol mission over Truk Lagoon on April 2, 1944. Sakai had survived hundreds of combat missions through superior piloting skill and intimate knowledge of his Zero's capabilities. His encounter with the F4U Corsair nearly ended his career permanently. Sakai approached the Corsair from above and behind, using classic tactics that had served him well against machine gun-armed fighters. His plan was to close to point-blank range, fire a concentrated burst, then use the Zero's superior maneuverability to escape before the American could respond. The tactic had worked successfully dozens of times against P-42s, F-4Fs, and machine gun-armed Corsairs. As Sakai opened fire, the American pilot immediately rolled inverted and pulled through a split-S maneuver, exactly as Sakai had anticipated. The Japanese ace followed, confident in his ability to outturn the heavier American fighter. But as he pulled his Zero through the bottom of the maneuver, the Corsair's pilot reversed direction and fired a brief burst. Sakai's Zero absorbed 4 20mm high-explosive shells. The first detonated in the engine compartment, severing oil lines and destroying the reduction gear. The second and third struck the wing root, exploding inside the main fuel tank. The fourth hit the cockpit area, sending fragments through the canopy and wounding Sakai in the face and shoulder. Only extraordinary piloting skill and considerable luck allowed Sakai to nurse his burning Zero back to Truk. In his post-war memoir, he described the encounter as a revelation. I had been hit many times before by machine gun fire, holes in the wings, damaged controls, wounded, but always able to continue fighting or escape. The cannon shells were different. They exploded inside my aircraft. There was no surviving multiple hits. 1 hit could be fatal. 2 hits certainly would be. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots extended beyond the immediate tactical disadvantage. The knowledge that a single burst from an American fighter could destroy their aircraft completely changed how they approached combat. Aggressive tactics that had worked against machine gun-armed opponents became suicidal against cannon-armed Corsairs. Japanese training doctrine had emphasized close-range combat, where the Zero's superior maneuverability provided decisive advantages. Pilots learned to engage American fighters at ranges of 100 yards or less, where the Zero could exploit its ability to turn inside larger, heavier opponents. Against cannon-armed aircraft, this doctrine became a prescription for death. The explosive power of 20mm shells meant that even brief exposure to enemy fire could be fatal. Japanese pilots could no longer rely on their aircraft's ability to absorb damage and continue fighting. The Zero's light construction, which had been an advantage in terms of speed and maneuverability, became a critical vulnerability when facing high-explosive ammunition. Spring 1944 brought an acceleration in F4U Corsair production and deployment. Marine and Navy squadrons throughout the Pacific began receiving cannon-armed aircraft. VMF-214, VMF-215, VMF-218, and VF-17 were among the first units to be fully equipped with the new variant. Training programs emphasized the cannon's advantages while teaching pilots to compensate for its limitations. The limited ammunition capacity required fundamental changes in gunnery doctrine. Pilots were taught to close to shorter ranges before firing, ensuring that their limited cannon shells would achieve maximum effect. They learned to fire in shorter bursts, typically 1 to 2 seconds, rather than the sustained fire that machine guns allowed. Most importantly, they were trained to aim for center mass, where cannon shells were most likely to detonate inside vital aircraft systems. Combat reports from spring and summer 1944 documented the cannons' devastating effectiveness. Squadron after squadron reported improved kill ratios compared to their previous performance with machine gun armament. VMF 215 achieved a 13-to-1 kill ratio during their deployment with F4U Corsair aircraft, compared to 8-to-1 with machine gun-armed Corsairs. The statistical improvement reflected more than just superior firepower. The psychological effect of facing cannon-armed opponents caused Japanese pilots to modify their tactics in ways that further disadvantaged them. Unable to survive close-range engagements, Japanese fighters were forced to attack from longer ranges, where their light weapons were less effective and their maneuverability advantages were reduced. Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nishizawa, known as the Devil of Rabaul and credited with 87 aerial victories, described the tactical dilemma in his diary entries from June 1944. The Americans have made close combat impossible. Their cannons destroy our aircraft too quickly. We must attack from distance, but our guns are not effective at long range. We must hit and run, but the Corsair is faster than the Zero. We are left with no good options. The F4U Corsair's impact extended beyond individual combat encounters. Japanese squadron commanders found themselves unable to maintain experienced pilot strength as veterans were killed or wounded by cannon fire. The aircraft's ability to destroy targets with single hits meant that survival rates dropped dramatically among Japanese aviators facing cannon-armed opponents. By summer 1944, Japanese tactical doctrine had been fundamentally rewritten to account for American cannon armament. Pilots were instructed to avoid single combat with Corsairs whenever possible, to attack only when they held overwhelming numerical advantage, and to disengage immediately if their initial attack failed to achieve a kill. These defensive measures represented an admission that Japanese fighters could no longer compete on equal terms with cannon-armed American aircraft. The technical superiority of the 20mm cannon over the 50-caliber machine gun was demonstrated repeatedly in combat. Machine gun bullets, even when they hit vital areas, often failed to cause immediate aircraft destruction. Pilots could continue flying with damaged engines, severed control cables, or punctured fuel tanks. Cannon shells detonated inside aircraft structures, creating damage that was immediately catastrophic. Combat camera footage from F4U Corsair aircraft, when available, showed the dramatic difference in target effects. Machine gun attacks typically produced sparks and small pieces of debris as bullets struck target aircraft. Cannon attacks produced spectacular explosions as high-explosive shells detonated inside enemy fighters. The visual difference was so pronounced that pilots could immediately assess the effectiveness of their fire. The ammunition itself represented a significant technological advantage. The 20mm high-explosive shell contained approximately 0.7 ounces of explosive, typically RDX or Composition A. When the shell struck an aircraft, a small delay fuse allowed it to penetrate the structure before detonating. The explosion created blast effects and fragmentation that could destroy multiple aircraft systems simultaneously. The fragmentation pattern was particularly devastating against aircraft. The shell casing, designed to break into predetermined fragments, created hundreds of high-velocity metal pieces that spread outward from the point of detonation. These fragments could sever control cables, puncture fuel lines, damage engines, and wound crew members across a wide area of the target aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The contrast with machine gun ammunition was stark. The 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary round relied primarily on its kinetic energy to damage targets. While effective against armored components, it created relatively small holes in aircraft structures. Unless the bullet struck a vital component directly, the target aircraft could often continue flying despite multiple hits. The psychological warfare aspect of cannon armament became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Japanese pilots began reporting to intelligence officers that American fighters had become impossible to survive against. The knowledge that a single burst could destroy their aircraft affected pilot morale and combat aggressiveness in measurable ways. Combat mission reports from late 1944 show increasing reluctance among Japanese pilots to engage American fighters. Interception rates dropped significantly as Japanese squadrons received orders to avoid combat unless absolutely necessary. When engagement was unavoidable, Japanese tactics became increasingly defensive, focused on survival rather than achieving victories. The industrial implications were equally significant. Japan's aircraft production, already strained by material shortages and bombing attacks, could not replace aircraft at the rate they were being destroyed by cannon-armed fighters. The improved kill efficiency of American pilots meant that Japanese aircraft losses accelerated even as the number of combat missions remained constant. By October 1944, when Lieutenant Commander Muto encountered his first cannon-armed Corsair over Leyte Gulf, the pattern was well established. Japanese pilots had learned to fear the distinctive sound of 20mm cannons firing, a rapid hammering that was distinctly different from machine gun fire. Those who heard it and survived often chose to disengage rather than press their attacks. The F4U-1C had fundamentally altered the mathematics of air combat in the Pacific. Where Japanese pilots had once relied on superior maneuverability and training to compensate for inferior numbers, they now faced American fighters that could destroy them with single hits, regardless of tactical positioning. The age of the dogfight, where skill and maneuverability determined outcomes, was ending. The age of firepower supremacy had begun. The cannon-armed Corsair represented more than just improved armament. It embodied a shift in American military philosophy toward technological solutions that multiplied individual effectiveness. Rather than training pilots for years to achieve the precision necessary to defeat skilled opponents, American industry provided weapons that made precision less critical and outcomes more certain. This technological approach to warfare would become characteristic of American military doctrine throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Superior firepower, advanced technology, and industrial capacity would consistently overcome opponents who relied primarily on individual skill and tactical innovation. The F4U-1C was among the first examples of this philosophy applied to fighter aviation. The Japanese response to cannon-armed fighters revealed the limitations of their military doctrine. Their emphasis on spiritual training, individual skill, and aircraft maneuverability could not compensate for technological inferiority. When American cannons could destroy Japanese fighters with single hits, all other advantages became irrelevant. The story of the cannon-armed Corsair and its impact on Japanese aviation represents a broader narrative about technological change in warfare. Innovation that provides decisive tactical advantages can rapidly render existing doctrine obsolete, forcing opponents to adapt or face inevitable defeat. The Japanese Imperial Navy's failure to develop equivalent weapons systems ensured that their pilots would face increasingly impossible odds as the war progressed. As 1944 drew to a close, the pattern was unmistakable. American cannon armament had broken the back of Japanese fighter resistance. What had begun as tactical innovation had become strategic dominance, achieved one devastating burst of cannon fire at a time. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 marked the turning point where cannon-armed Corsairs demonstrated their full potential against massed Japanese formations. Operation Forager, the American assault on the Mariana Islands, drew the largest Japanese naval aviation response since Midway. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet launched over 400 aircraft from 9 aircraft carriers in what Japanese planners called the decisive battle that would determine the war's outcome. The American response included 6 fast carrier task groups with over 900 aircraft, including substantial numbers of F4U-1C Corsairs aboard USS Essex, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet. The cannon-armed fighters were specifically assigned to combat air patrol duties, positioned to intercept incoming Japanese strikes before they could reach the American fleet. On June 19th, The first day of what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the effectiveness of cannon armament became undeniably apparent. Japanese formations approaching the American fleet encountered walls of cannon fire that no amount of skill or maneuverability could overcome. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying an F-6F Hellcat, would become the Navy's leading ace that day, but it was the cannon-armed Corsairs that created the most devastating scenes of aerial destruction. Lieutenant Robert Klingman, flying F4U Bureau, number 82347 from VF-17, aboard USS Hornet, engaged a formation of 12, a 6M0s and 4D-4Y Judy, dive bombers approaching from the northwest. His combat report, filed immediately after landing, described an encounter that epitomized the cannon's revolutionary impact on aerial warfare. I approached the enemy formation from above and astern at approximately 28,000 feet. The lead section of Zeros began a climbing turn to engage. I selected the lead aircraft and fired a 1-second burst from 400 yards. Observed immediate explosion and complete destruction of target. Selected second aircraft, fired again, similar result. The remaining enemy aircraft scattered, but their evasive maneuvers brought them into range of my wingmen. We destroyed 7 of the 12 Zeros within 90 seconds. The dive bombers jettisoned their loads and attempted to escape at low altitude. The mathematics of destruction were unprecedented. Where machine gun-armed fighters might have required sustained combat to achieve multiple kills, cannon-armed aircraft were destroying Japanese fighters with single bursts. The explosive power of 20mm shells eliminated the possibility of damaged aircraft escaping or continuing to fight. Every hit was potentially fatal, every burst could end multiple lives. Japanese pilot Lieutenant Zenji Abe, flying with the 601st Naval Air Group, survived the first day's combat and provided a devastating assessment in his diary. The American cannons make our aircraft disappear. Not damaged, not smoking, but gone completely. The pilot does not have time to bail out. The aircraft simply explodes and falls burning into the sea. We cannot fight weapons that destroy us instantly. The second day of the Philippine Sea battle brought an even more complete demonstration of American firepower superiority. Japanese formations, already reduced by the previous day's losses, faced concentrated cannon fire from multiple American squadrons. The results were so one-sided that American pilots began running out of targets despite the presence of hundreds of Japanese aircraft. Commander William Dean, leading VF-2 from USS Hornet, described the tactical situation in his action report. Enemy formations appeared disorganized and reluctant to press attacks. Individual aircraft would approach our formations, fire from extreme range, then immediately disengage. Those that attempted close-range attacks were destroyed before they could complete their attack runs. The enemy's reluctance to engage at effective ranges made our interception missions almost routine. The psychological collapse of Japanese naval aviation was becoming apparent to American commanders. Pilots who had once pressed home attacks with suicidal determination were now breaking off engagements at the first sign of resistance. The knowledge that cannon fire meant instant death had fundamentally altered Japanese combat behavior. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, observing the battle from his base on Guam, wrote in his memoir about the demoralization spreading through Japanese aviation units. Our young pilots were being taught that survival was impossible against American cannons. They were told to avoid close combat, to attack only when certain of success, to disengage immediately if the Americans turned to fight. These were not the tactics of a navy that expected to win. These were the tactics of a navy that expected to lose. The industrial implications of cannon effectiveness extended far beyond individual combat encounters. Japanese aircraft production, already severely constrained by material shortages and strategic bombing, could not replace aircraft at the rate they were being destroyed. The improved kill efficiency of American pilots accelerated Japanese losses, even as the total number of American sorties remained relatively constant. By July 1944, Japanese naval aviation strength had dropped to levels that made large-scale operations impossible. The mobile fleet's air groups, which had launched over 400 aircraft in June, could barely assemble 100 operational fighters by month's end. The attrition rate against cannon-armed opponents had proven unsustainable. The strategic impact became apparent during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Japanese naval forces attempting to disrupt American landings in the Philippines found themselves without adequate air cover. The few Japanese aircraft that did engage American forces were quickly eliminated by cannon-armed fighters that had become the standard equipment for most Marine and Navy squadrons. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, issued orders on October 19th that reflected the desperate situation facing Japanese aviation. Unable to achieve air superiority through conventional means, Onishi authorized the formation of special attack units, the Kamikaze Corps. The decision represented an admission that Japanese fighters could no longer compete with American aircraft in normal combat. The kamikaze tactic was, in part, a response to the effectiveness of American cannon armament. If Japanese pilots could not survive conventional air-to-air combat long enough to achieve victories, perhaps they could achieve strategic impact through suicide attacks that guaranteed target destruction. The shift to kamikaze tactics represented the ultimate acknowledgement that technological inferiority had made traditional fighter combat impossible. Lieutenant Commander Kaneyoshi Muto's final combat mission over Leyte Gulf typified the hopeless situation facing conventional Japanese fighter pilots. Flying an obsolescent A-6M0 against cannon-armed Corsairs, equipped with primitive radio equipment and limited ammunition, Muto represented the end of an era in naval aviation. His aircraft, once the most advanced carrier fighter in the world, had become a death trap against opponents armed with weapons that could destroy it instantly. The encounter that claimed Muto's life lasted less than 30 seconds. According to American combat reports, 4 F4U Corsairs from VMF 214 intercepted his section of 6 Zeros as they attempted to attack American shipping in Leyte Gulf. The American pilots, led by Major Robert Owens, engaged from altitude using standard tactics that had proven devastatingly effective throughout the summer. Owens selected Muto's aircraft as his primary target, closing to 300 yards before firing a 2-second burst from his 4 20mm cannons. 22 high-explosive shells struck the Zero across its engine compartment and wing route. The aircraft exploded so completely that no recognizable debris larger than a few feet was recovered. Muto, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots with 37 confirmed victories, was killed instantly. The remaining 5 Zeros scattered without engaging, their pilots recognizing the futility of pressing an attack against cannon-armed opponents. This pattern-brief engagement, followed by immediate Japanese withdrawal, had become standard throughout the Pacific, as Japanese pilots learned that survival depended on avoiding prolonged combat with American fighters. The technical advantages of cannon armament were so pronounced that Japanese engineers attempted to develop equivalent weapons for their own fighters. The Navy's Kawanishi N-1K Shiden and the Army's Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien were designed to carry 20mm cannons, but production difficulties and material shortages prevented these aircraft from reaching combat units in significant numbers. More critically, Japanese cannon development lagged behind American advances in ammunition technology. While Japanese 20mm shells were adequate for destroying lightly built aircraft, American high-explosive rounds incorporated more advanced fusing systems and more powerful explosives. The result was that even when Japanese fighters carried cannons, they remained at a disadvantage against opponents whose weapons were simply more destructive. The ammunition capacity issue that had initially concerned American pilots proved less significant in practice than anticipated. While the F4U carried only 240 rounds compared to the F4U-1's 2,400 rounds, combat experience showed that cannon-armed pilots achieved kills with far fewer rounds fired. The devastating effectiveness of individual cannon shells more than compensated for the reduced ammunition load. Squadron armament officers documented this trend throughout 1944. VMF 215's records show that their F4U-1C aircraft averaged 1.8 aerial victories per 100 rounds of cannon ammunition expended, compared to 0.6 victories per 100 rounds for machine gun-armed squadrons. The cannon's superior effectiveness meant that pilots actually had more effective combat time, despite carrying less total ammunition. The maintenance advantages of cannon armament also became apparent during extended combat operations. 20mm cannons proved more reliable than 50-caliber machine guns under the harsh conditions of Pacific combat. The cannon's slower rate of fire generated less heat and caused less barrel wear, while their simpler ammunition feed systems were less prone to jamming in the humid, salt-air environment of carrier operations. Ground crews reported that cannon-armed aircraft required less time between missions for weapons maintenance. The reduced number of guns, 4 cannons versus 6 machine guns, simplified pre-flight inspections and reduced the probability of weapons malfunctions. These operational advantages multiplied the cannon's combat effectiveness by ensuring higher aircraft availability rates. The psychological impact on American pilots was equally significant. Pilots flying cannon-armed aircraft reported increased confidence and aggressiveness in combat. The knowledge that their weapons could destroy enemy aircraft with single hits encouraged pilots to press attacks that might have been abandoned with less effective armament. This psychological advantage translated into tactical superiority that extended beyond the weapon's technical capabilities. Flight training programs were modified to emphasize the cannon's unique characteristics. Pilots learned that effective gunnery required different techniques than machine gun firing. The cannon's slower rate of fire demanded more precise aiming, while their limited ammunition required careful target selection. However, the devastating effect of hits encouraged pilots to accept these trade-offs. Advanced gunnery training incorporated lessons learned from combat experience. Pilots were taught to fire in short bursts, typically 1 to 2 seconds, rather than sustained fire. They learned to aim for center mass where cannon shells were most likely to detonate inside vital aircraft systems. Most importantly, they were trained to expect immediate target destruction rather than the gradual damage accumulation associated with machine gun fire. The evolution of American fighter tactics reflected the cannon's capabilities. Traditional dogfighting maneuvers designed to position aircraft for sustained firing opportunities became less relevant when single bursts could achieve kills. Instead, pilots learned to use speed and altitude advantages to create brief firing opportunities that maximized the cannon's destructive potential. This tactical evolution represented a fundamental shift in fighter pilot training and doctrine. Where previous generations of pilots had learned elaborate aerial maneuvers designed to outfly opponents, cannon-armed pilots focused on positioning tactics that created optimal firing solutions. The emphasis shifted from aerial acrobatics to precision gunnery and tactical positioning. By winter 1944, the transformation of Pacific air combat was complete. Japanese fighter resistance had collapsed under the devastating fighter effectiveness of American cannon armament. The few Japanese aircraft that still attempted to engage American forces did so with tactics that emphasized survival over victory, avoiding the close-range combat where cannon fire was most effective. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual combat encounters. Japanese naval aviation, once capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, had been reduced to defensive operations around the home islands. The loss of experienced pilots to cannon fire had created a training crisis that Japanese aviation never resolved. American industrial production of cannon-armed fighters accelerated throughout 1945. The F4U, the final production variant of the Corsair, was designed from the beginning to carry 4 20mm cannons as standard armament. Machine gun armament was relegated to specialized variants designed for specific missions where the higher ammunition capacity was considered essential. The cannon-armed Corsair's influence extended beyond the Pacific War. Post-war fighter development emphasized cannon armament as the standard for air-to-air combat. The lessons learned from F4U operations that explosive shells were far more effective than solid bullets against aircraft targets became fundamental doctrine that influenced fighter design for decades. Modern fighter aircraft continue to carry cannons derived from the technology pioneered in the F4U-1C. The M61 Vulcan cannon used in contemporary American fighters fires 20mm rounds that trace their lineage directly back to the Hispano-Suiza cannons that revolutionized Pacific air combat in 1944. The human cost of this technological revolution was enormous. Japanese aviation losses during the final year of the war were unprecedented, with experienced pilots killed at rates that made replacement impossible. The cannon's effectiveness accelerated the collapse of Japanese air power, contributing directly to the strategic bombing campaign's success and the war's eventual conclusion. Lieutenant Commander Kaneyoshi Muto's death over Leyte Gulf represented more than the loss of a single pilot. It symbolized the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. The technological advantage provided by cannon armament had proven decisive, creating a level of combat effectiveness that Japanese pilots could not match regardless of their skill or determination. The final phase of the Pacific War saw cannon-armed Corsairs operating with near impunity over Japanese territory. The devastating effectiveness of their armament had eliminated organized fighter resistance, allowing American bombers to attack strategic targets with minimal opposition. The cannons that had once seemed like a simple technical improvement had become instruments of strategic dominance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.